how we treat animals in video games have any real-world bearing on how we treat animals in real life? Is violence against animals in games a problem? Are animal violence mechanics even necessary to have fun in games? These are all questions I've been thinking about for a long time and been wanting to make a video about for a long time. After the response to the Palworld section of my Good Vegan News video from back in February, I thought that it was finally time. I've done a number of videos on my channel about how animals and animal foods are represented in media, mostly film and TV. And since we're at a point now where the gaming industry has surpassed the film and music industries combined in terms of global revenue generated, this topic feels more relevant than ever and something that will only become more and more a part of our lives. In this video, I'm narrowing my lens of focus to 4 games: Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing, Palworld, and Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom. For the sake of this video, I'm only going to be referring to Breath of the Wild, but a lot of the things I refer to apply to Tears of the Kingdom as well. This is a huge topic that could honestly span multiple videos, but to keep it as simple as possible, I've broken things down into the following sections: consumable food items in games and how animal foods are incorporated, portrayal of animals as characters and enemies, use of animals in game mechanics, if animal treatment in games has real-world implications, and whether or not video games can be vegan friendly. I first want to go briefly into the history of my relationship with video games to give a little context. Like many children of the 90s, I wasn't allowed to play video games at my house. The closest thing we were allowed were sort of educational genre computer games. Shout out to the Magic School Bus, shout out Oregon Trail, shout out Operation Neptune. Video games were something I only got glimpses of at friends' houses, and there were some I really liked. I absolutely loved Crash Bandicoot, and I would beg my friend to play it whenever I was at her house. Sometimes she let me, sometimes she wouldn't. As I got older, I became a person who didn't really care about games / maybe even had a negative opinion of them. That all changed when I met my boyfriend in 2016, who is a game designer and very passionate about games. Through him, I discovered a love for gaming, especially because the first full year we were dating, 2017, was a very good year for games. It's the year Breath of the Wild, Stardew Valley, and Mario Odyssey came out. I've learned there's a very specific type of game I like, which I'd describe as open world adventure and cozy games, and also apparently farming sims. My favorite games are pretty much all Nintendo games, with the exception of Stardew Valley, and these are the games I'm most familiar with, which is why I've chosen to focus on them in this video. So let's talk about consumable food items and how animal foods are incorporated. Food in video games is often used to restore health and stamina. They're things you need to keep the player healthy and prevent them from dying. Meat, primarily chicken, is historically the classic food you would eat to gain health in video games, which sort of makes a statement to players that meat is the be-all end-all healthiest food. In Breath of the Wild, I was pretty pleasantly surprised that you can get equal amounts of health from plant and animal foods. In fact, some of the most health-restoring items in the game, the big hearty truffle and the big hearty radish, are plants. And in general, for any animal food that gives a certain power or ability, there's usually a plant counterpart. For example, a Staminoka bass gives you stamina when cooked, but Stamella shrooms will do the same thing, although not in the exact same amount. There are also some hearty animal ingredients, but actually 5 out of 8 hearty ingredients in the game are plants. I appreciate that Breath of the Wild gives pretty equal weight to plant and animal foods, not positioning either one as the ultimate healthiest food. In Stardew Valley, all of the consumable food items and recipes you can make fall under the category of pescatarian. There is no meat in the game from land animals. However, there are farm animals in the game, and you can collect their byproducts, and this is something we'll discuss in a later section. In Animal Crossing New Horizons, again, all the foods you can make are pescatarian. There's no meat from land animals, but food in Animal Crossing isn't nearly as important as food in Breath of the Wild, for example. Really, the only thing you need energy for in Animal Crossing is digging up trees and destroying rocks on your island. On the topic of Animal Crossing, let's get into the use of animals as characters. Animals are omnipresent in Animal Crossing New Horizons, as the whole premise of the game is you move to an island and all the other villagers are animals. In fact, you as the player are the only human in the whole game. The game paints a pretty picture of everyone living in harmony, even though some of these animals are species humans would exploit in real life. So it's all a bit humane washed, but then again, it is aimed at a younger audience than a game like Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, there are these animalistic races that live in the different regions. The Zora people are an aquatic folk who possess fish and amphibian-like traits, including fins, webbed feet, and gills. Then there's the Rito, who are people who possess avian features, including wings which give them the ability of flight. Each region has a town with an inn, and Rito Village is sort of this big, elaborate treehouse. The inn in Rito Village is called Swallow's Roost, and when you visit, you're informed you can stay in a standard bed or a Rito down bed for an upcharge. When Link, the main character, asks what a Rito down bed is, he's informed it's made using only genuine Rito feathers. Now, of course, this stuck out to me because the down industry is notoriously inhumane, with a majority of ducks and geese coming from factory farms, being plucked alive, which is extremely cruel and painful, and then being slaughtered at just a few weeks or months old for meat or foie gras, despite having a natural lifespan of over a decade. So you're telling me that while some of the Rito are living in this idyllic treehouse, somewhere else, maybe outside the borders of the game's map, there's a factory farm where all the Rito down is being farmed? This is a prime example of a game humane washing a real world thing that happens and is horrifically cruel. And someone could say, oh, well, maybe they just use the feathers that fall off the Rito naturally, but that in and of itself is a humane washed representation of the down industry. The only way to acquire enough feathers to fill an entire bed with them realistically would be a scenario like factory farming. Another thing that really stood out to me in Breath of the Wild is an interaction that Link has with a Rito in another region. In Gerudo Town, Link meets a Rito named Frida. She's admiring the meat on display at a vendor, but she says she wishes there was poultry. This really disturbed me the first time I saw it, because I was like, why is the bird woman craving poultry? I guess some birds do eat other birds, but it seems like it's kind of rare. In the Zelda wiki, it says the Rito prefer to eat meat or fish like birds of prey. But poultry? Like maybe they're also harvesting Rito flesh at the Rito Feather Factory farm, but it seems more to me like something that just wasn't fully thought through, or it was intentionally done as some sort of perverse joke. Now let's move on to the use of animals as enemies. In Breath of the Wild, aside from the animal-like non-playable characters, there are also animal-like enemies. The main enemy types in Breath of the Wild are bokoblins, moblins, and lizalfos. There are a ton of other enemy types, but these are the most common ones. And they all sort of resemble animals. Bokoblins kind of resemble pigs and make pig-like sounds like snorts and squeals. Lizalfos resemble lizards and make reptilian sounds. With moblins, it's harder to say what they resemble. I'd say somewhat of an anteater dog hybrid. In past Zelda games, moblins have actually been represented as more explicitly dog-like and pig-like. The origin of these creatures is that they seem to have been possessed by an evil malice at some point. For me, although these creatures have animal-like qualities, it's easier for me to justify killing them, I guess because they're portrayed as evil and trying to kill me. Although I do definitely have moments where I feel bad because of the ways they react to being hurt, feeling vaguely animal-like. Now, of course, we have to talk about Palworld because it's more of a recent game and there's been more recent controversy around it. In Palworld, the goal is to collect these animal-like creatures called pals, which you then force to work for you and help you in various ways. The way you collect them is by essentially hitting them or hurting them in some way until they're weak enough to capture. They cry when they're getting hit, they react much like real-life animals would, and you can kill them, but you're mainly trying to capture them so they can work for you. Now again, these aren't technically animals, but many of them have undeniable resemblances to certain animals, and the names confirm this connection. And also, they're not really enemies per se, they're more tools you can use, but like I said, some will try to hurt you or fight you. We will talk more about Palworld later in the video, but for now, let's get into the use of animals within game mechanics. In video games, there are various mechanics and challenges that ask the player to interact with animals in certain ways and sometimes kill them. In Breath of the Wild, since pretty much the entire game takes place in an open outdoor landscape, there are plenty plenty of wild animals that you encounter, like deer, boar, goats, and many others. For the most part, these animals completely leave you alone, and it's your choice how you want to interact with them. When I play, I avoid killing these animals when I encounter them, and I am always surprised when I watch gameplay footage of other people playing and they will literally kill every single animal they encounter. And I sort of do wonder about the psychology of that, like why do some people go out of their way to avoid it, some people go out of their way to do it? Does that translate at all into people's real world views on animal exploitation? I really don't know. I'm just wondering. In general, there's really no reason to kill these wild animals unless there's something like a fetch quest where someone asks you like, hey, could you go bring me some wild boar meat? And then you go and do that. But even then, those are side quests and you can always choose not to do them. These animals I'm talking about aren't really a major part of the gameplay. They're more part of the ambiance of the game. But a major mechanic in Breath of the Wild is horseback riding. In real life, horseback riding is considered to be unethical for many reasons. The main one being that horses can't consent to being ridden. We have no way of knowing what horseback riding is actually like for horses, how much pain they're in, what it's like to have a human adult sitting on their back, not to mention the many harmful breeding practices and inhumane treatment within the industry where horses are often seen as money-making machines and not sentient creatures. Outside of my real-world views on horseback riding, I never found the horseback riding experience in Breath of the Wild to be that fun or useful. I found myself mostly wanting to be on foot while playing, but I feel like I'm in the minority because people really seem to love and heavily utilize the horseback riding mechanic. You can also get a horse to ride in Stardew Valley. It's not as big a part of the game though. And because the game is a farming simulator, you can have farm animals as part of the game. While the game starts out heavily encouraging you to grow fruit and vegetables, at a certain point after you've upgraded your farm, you can buy farm animals like chickens, cows, pigs, and goats. You then build up relationships with these animals by taking care of them and petting them, and eventually they start producing items you can take, including eggs, milk, feathers, wool, truffles, etc. Now this alone presents a pretty humane-washed version of animal agriculture. All you have to do is acquire a cow or goat and eventually it will just start producing milk for you. It kind of promotes the magically milk-producing misconception about cows. In reality, milk production requires a female cow or goat to become impregnated, give birth, have the baby taken away and often killed so that humans can take the milk, and it's a constant cycle of forced pregnancy, birth, separation, and death. None of which is portrayed in Stardew Valley. You just grab a bucket and magically milk your cow once you've built up enough hearts with them. As far as the death of farm animals in the game, Eric Barone, the solo designer and developer of Stardew Valley, notably is vegetarian, and he revealed something pretty interesting in this interview with Vulture back in 2016. Beta testers had asked Barone to include a feature that enabled users to butcher their animals and harvest the meat, and he listened to them at first, but in the end he couldn't bring himself to include the mechanic. I didn't want to have that sort of violence. You give the animals names, pet them, and a little heart goes above their head and stuff, and then you butcher them? It just felt wrong. It didn't jibe with the feeling I was going for with the game, so I cut that and I don't regret it. I have a few thoughts on this. In this soundbite, he's essentially calling out cognitive dissonance, or at least calling attention to the moral quandary of can you love an animal and also kill them? But it's also interesting because this is what a lot of farmers do. Form a bond with an animal, gain their love and trust, and then kill them. And I really like that he said it didn't jibe with the feeling of the game. That's my issue with a lot of these games, is that they feel so charming and cozy, but then a character will say something or the player will be asked to do something that feels contrary to the established vibe. I also find it interesting that his beta testers wanted this and were asking for it, and that he didn't ultimately include it. Did this decision impact the overall fun of the game? Did it impact how much money the game made? Stardew Valley is one of the most successful indie games of all time, having recently crossed the milestone of 30 million copies sold, which, according to my calculations, is a shit ton of money. So no, I don't think not being able to butcher your animals made a huge difference in the end. Something Stardew Valley does incorporate is fishing, which is something I can't make this video without discussing. Fishing is a classic game mechanic or mini mini game that appears to have first been implemented by Nintendo in 1993. Watching my boyfriend Paul play Stardew Valley was the first time I had seen a fishing mechanic in a game. My first reaction was, this is fucked up. Like, fishing is not humane, this is wrong. And Paul's reaction was, I know, but it's really fun. Since then, I have played the fishing mini games in Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing, and Mario Odyssey, and I have to say, it is pretty fun. But in all cases, the fishing mini game isn't really a realistic portrayal of fishing in real life, at least as far as I know. Admittedly, I don't remember, I haven't been fishing in a very long time. And what you do with the fish after catching them is completely unrealistic. In real life, if someone was fishing, as far as I know, they would either club the fish to death or the fish would suffocate to death. In both Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley, the fish just magically go into your backpack after you catch them, which is not only unrealistic, but kind of horrifying to think about. You can then sell the fish, or in the case of Animal Crossing, donate them to the museum where they magically come back to life and swim in tanks, which is like, at least they're alive, but also they've been stolen out of their natural habitats to just live in these glass cages. In Stardew Valley, you can donate them to the community center, which essentially means offering them up to these mythical tree creatures. Who knows if the fish are dead or alive at that point. In Animal Crossing, you can also catch critters, which is another mini game where you catch bugs with your net. And again, you can sell them for in-game currency or donate them to the museum, where they live in a somewhat natural, recreated environment, but again, wouldn't they be better off in their actual natural environment? My question is, are these mechanics really necessary? And if they are, is there a world in which we could have fish catching or critter catching mechanics, but then there's some type of catch and release system where you still get credit for having caught them, but you release them? Sadly, it occurs to me that part of the fun of the fishing mechanic is the implication that the fish are fighting back or trying not to get caught, resisting in some way, which is part of what makes the minigame challenging. I just have to think there has to be another option. Like, can't we capture the fun of the fishing mechanic without actually capturing fish? Is there some other more humane minigame that could replace it, like picking fruit from a tree? Or even something involving animals but where there's no suffering or exploitation involved? I have to think there is. This brings us nicely to discussing if animal treatment in games has any real-world implications. I feel like this is a parallel conversation to the one about whether violence in video games in general translates to real-world violence. Obviously, this is a long-standing debate and criticism of video games, how violent some of them are, how some of them glorify violence, and this is a whole other topic that I'm not really qualified to discuss. From my research, the consensus seems to be that while playing violent video games can result in an increased display of aggressive behaviors, there's not sufficient research to confirm playing games leads to carrying out violent acts. I personally don't like violence of any kind in games. I get upset by it and just don't enjoy it. And I think a lot of this comes down to whether you're used to it or not. In my observation, people who grew up playing games or have been playing them for a long time don't seem to be as bothered by it compared to people like me who didn't grow up with it, aren't used to it. I want to get into the comments I was referencing before on my Good Vegan News video about the violence in Palworld. Really what I found most interesting was the spectrum of opinions expressed on the topic. A few people expressed that they found Palworld really disturbing, while others who are vegan enjoyed it and saw no problem with it. One comment stated that video games with fictional violence don't encourage people to do those things in real life because there's no ethical consequence doing it in games, but there is in real life. And I really liked this response. It's not that they make people violent, but they make them less sensible to violence. This is the conclusion of most of the studies you're referring to. Also, killing humans is not part of the norm, while accepting the unnecessary suffering and killing of animals is unfortunately considered normal. This is an important distinction. This is really what it comes down to for me. People might not think twice about violence against humans in video games because it's so clearly wrong in real life. Violence against animals is not so clearly considered wrong in real life to most of the population. And in my opinion, normalizing it isn't great, whether that's in books, TV shows, movies, or video games. Some people seem to think the violence in Palworld may actually have a positive impact in that being upset by the violence against the pals may lead people to question and reflect upon animal exploitation in real life, which I think is a possible outcome, but I don't in any way believe that was the intention. Many people pointed out that Palworld obviously drew a lot of inspiration from Pokemon, which has a similar premise, or the exact same premise. Some comments even posited that this game was specifically designed to mock the cruelty in Pokemon. And this actually seems to be a pretty common interpretation, that the violence is intentionally played up in an almost comical way in order to make a statement. There was also this trolley comment, "PETA, please save the pixels, the vegans are sad," which I have to admit was pretty funny. Like, I can hand it to a troll when they're funny who said vegans don't have a sense of humor. I actually thought this was a funny comment. But I also feel like my response was pretty great. Were you affected when Mufasa died in The Lion King? How about when Bambi's mom was killed? Just because something is pixelated doesn't mean it can't incite a human emotional response. This is what storytelling does, and video games are a form of storytelling. For those who are against violence toward animals, a pixelated animated representation complete with sound effects of an animal being harmed and or killed is understandably going to be unpleasant. Aren't there other ways for a player to have fun besides bludgeoning and enslaving a sheep? I think so, and to deny that betrays laziness and an utter lack of creativity. And that, my friends, is how you respond to a troll. Part of what's upsetting to me is not just how the treatment of animals in games may shape the real world, but also that our treatment of animals in the real world is reflected in these games, and that's upsetting to see. Even in, yes, Dino Preemie, even in pixelated format. So now let's discuss, can you play and enjoy games as a vegan? In my opinion, yes, of course you can. I don't think that killing animals in games makes you any less vegan, but I do acknowledge that many vegans, myself included, may not be able to enjoy a game as much when it involves animal exploitation. I had an idea years ago that it would be fun to try to play Breath of the Wild as a vegan, and of course, I'm not the only one who had this idea, a lot of other people did. This blog post details one woman's attempt to play Breath of the Wild as a vegan. Her conclusion was that it was harder than she expected, but still easier than in the real world. And in a game like Breath of the Wild or Stardew Valley, it really prioritizes player freedom, meaning you can play exactly how you want to play. You don't want to have farm animals? You don't need to have farm animals. You don't want to consume any meat? You don't have to consume any meat. And I can definitely acknowledge that as something to be appreciated. Although often in these games you can't avoid the concept of animal exploitation, at least you can choose to avoid it, just like you can in real life. There is a game called Dead Cells, which came out in 2018 that I haven't played, but Paul told me about. And in this game, there is actually a menu option where you can play as a vegetarian, meaning you will only be given and find vegetarian food items. They also have carnivore and fruitarian, among a few other options. So obviously the game isn't just catering to vegetarians and not even specifically to vegans, but it's interesting to see vegetarianism acknowledged in an official way in a game. I also think it's great that games are starting to be used specifically for animal rights activism, but I also don't think it needs to be that. I don't need to have a game specifically about saving animals and having it be this noble thing. Although that sounds really cool and I'm excited for the prospect of those games are also then inevitably about animal exploitation, and therefore not really the escape that a lot of vegan gamers might be looking for. I just want to play a fun game where animals happen to not be exploited or harmed as any part of the gameplay. Is that so much to ask? The continued use of classical mechanics like fishing and hunting probably come from a place of reliance on tradition. If I'm being generous, I'd say it's designers and developers wanting to uphold time-honored video game traditions. But if I'm being slightly critical, I'd say it betrays a bit of a creative complacency, possibly a fear of the unknown, not wanting to break with tried and true mechanics. But I certainly hope we'll see some more innovation in this regard in the future. I'm aware there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, more examples out there around animal treatment, cognitive dissonance, humane washing, etc. I'm just not familiar with that many games, and the ones I am familiar with clearly provided plenty of content for this video. Let me know where you guys stand on all of this. I find the variety of stances, even just among vegans, pretty fascinating. As always, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more videos like this. Again, we are trying to get to 5,000 subscribers by May 21st, my 5-year channelversary, and it would mean so much to me if you could help me get there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!